أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Now, this is our fourth lesson, and in our fourth lesson today, we shall be talking about protection of persons and regulation of hostilities under international humanitarian law. So this is going to be our lesson today. Now, these are our lesson's objectives. That is, by the end of the lesson today, the students should be able to, number one, you should be able to do what? You should be able to distinguish between combatants and civilians, explain the principle. Yesterday we explained this, we shall not do this today. Identify the protective medical emblem and state the duty to collect and care for all wounded, sick, and shipwrecked. List fundamental rights of prisoners of war. Describe the special protection for women and children in armed conflicts. Define protected civilian objects and articulate the duty to protect humanitarian and medical personnel. Then apply the international humanitarian law principles to evaluate the lawfulness of means and methods of warfare. Then lastly, categorize and justify the prohibition of specific weapons under the international humanitarian law. So in brief, this is what we shall be discussing in our lesson today. Okay, let's start. So this is our introduction. Now, the international humanitarian law provides comprehensive protection to persons affected by armed conflict and regulates how hostilities must be conducted. Its central aim is to minimize human suffering while recognizing the realities of war. The protection regime applies in both international armed conflicts and the non-international armed conflicts, though the scope of protection may vary. So here they're basically telling us that the international humanitarian law provides protections to some groups of people affected by armed conflicts. And today we shall be talking about those groups of people who are provided, who are protected by the international what? By the international humanitarian law. So number one, the first group of people we shall be talking about today, this is the first group of people. They are called the protection of civilians during armed conflict. So how do you protect them? Who are civilians? So this is what we are going to cover in the first part, in the first group of people who are being protected by the international humanitarian law. So number one, what is the legal basis of protecting civilians in any war? So in the Fourth Geneva Convention of the 1949, it is clearly stated that the Fourth Geneva Convention is the primary international treaty that governs the protection of civilians in times of war and occupation. So it defines protected persons as civilians who find themselves during armed conflict or occupation in the hands of a party to the conflict or occupying power of which they are not national. The convention establishes rules on humane treatment, prohibition of violence, collective punishment, and protection of civilian property. So if you want to know, if you want to read the details of how the civilians are protected, you have to go to the Fourth Geneva Convention and read it in detail. So it defines who the civilians are. They are protected persons who find themselves in the mess. There is a war, for example, and they find themselves in the midst of the war. So the war clearly states that this group of people, they should be treated in an humane way. They should be protected from violence, and they should not be punished. There should be no collective punishment. You cannot punish the army plus the civilians, like just what the Israel is doing, what it was doing for the past 2.5 years in Palestine. It was collective punishment, which is not allowed. Now, what is the meaning of this word civilian? We need to understand this word civilian. What does civilian mean? So a civilian is defined under international humanitarian law as any person who is not a member of the armed forces. So number one, you should not be in the military or militias. Maybe a Shabab, maybe you should not be a member of the Shabab, so you are a civilian, or organized armed group of a party to the conflict, or you should not be a member of any armed group. So civilians do not participate in hostilities and are therefore entitled to protection. Because they don't participate in the war, then they are protected by the law. So under additional protocol 1, in case of doubt whether a person is a civilian, that person shall be considered a civilian. So this presumption aims to prevent unlawful targeting and ensure maximum protection. So for example, there is a war, but you don't know, you find a person, you don't know if this person is a civilian or he is not a civilian. So what should you do? They say you should consider this person, first of all, and then that this is a civilian. So that is the rule. Now, what is the scope of protection? What are the defined rights? How are they protected? Those are the civilians. Number one, protection from direct attack. So protection from direct attack means that civilians may never be deliberately targeted during military operations. So you cannot deliberately target civilians. Attacks may only be directed at lawful military objectives, not civilian persons. You can attack, the barracks. You can attack where the enemy is. You can attack their vehicles, but you cannot attack civilians. Number two, protection from collective punishment. So collective punishment refers to penalties imposed on a group of civilians for acts they did not individually commit. So the international humanitarian law strictly prohibits collective punishment, reprisal, and intimidation measures against civilian population. So what they are basically saying, like what is happening in America, for example, now, they are blaming all the Somali people collectively, which is very wrong. Yes, maybe there are 1, 2, 3 people in every community. We have mad people in every community. But you cannot just start to generalize and say that all the Somalis, they are not good. All the Somalis, they need to leave a country. No, the same thing applies in war. You cannot collectively attack people. No, you have to distinguish, Then protection from forced displacement. Forced displacement is what? In an exam, you can be asked, what is forceful displacement? So it is the unlawful removal of civilians from their homes or habitual residence. It is just like what the Israel, yani the Shayateen, it is what they are doing to the Gazans, They are deliberately displacing them. They want to remove them from their place and take them to another place. It's not allowed. So the international humanitarian law prohibits forcible transfer. You cannot remove me from my land. And deportation, you cannot deport me unless required for the safety of civilians or imperative military reason. Unless maybe deporting you will be to protect the other civilians. That is the only case that we can deport you. But you cannot be forced to leave your house. You cannot be forced to leave your land. It cannot happen. Then respect for life, dignity, religion, and property. Civilians are entitled to respect for their life. They should not be killed. Physical integrity, they should not be abused. Human dignity, religious practices, they have to practice their religion, custom, traditions, and civilian property. pillage, destruction of property not justified by military necessity, and humiliating treatment are prohibited. Now, the prohibition of attacks on civilians. We have the direct attacks against civilians. A direct attack is an attack intentionally, amdan, directed at civilians as such. Such attacks constitute grave breaches of the international humanitarian law and amounts to war crime. So you cannot deliberately, just like the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, what they are doing, they are deliberately killing innocent women, children, and civilians, deliberately. So they are, what is that? That is a war crime. They need to be arrested and they need to be charged. Then we also have the indiscriminate attacks. Indiscriminate attacks are attacks that are not directed at a specific military object or employ weapons or methods that cannot be limited as required by international humanitarian law. These attacks unlawfully affect civilians and civilian objects. So indiscriminate attack means you are attacking ashwaiya. Like you just come with a gun, you just start shooting, just like in Australia. The other time, there were some, I don't know, two Afghans, there were some Jews in the beach. They indiscriminately started shooting at anybody. That is what is called indiscriminate. It's not allowed in any war, you know? Then acts of terror against civilian population. Acts of terror are violent actions intended to spread fear among civilians rather than achieve a legitimate military objective. So the international humanitarian law expressly prohibits acts or threats of violence whose primary purpose is to terrorize the civilian population. So act of terror happens. It happened in Gaza. It happened in Congo. Now it is happening in Sudan. They are terrorizing the women, the children, the disabled. It's not allowed under the international humanitarian law. Now, loss of property. Loss of property. What is the definition and what is the limitation? So they're telling us civilians lose their protection against attack only for such time as they take a direct part in hostilities. So Al-Qaeda, the Qaeda says that civilians, they have to be protected. But when do they lose this right to be protected? متى يفقد هذه الحقوق يعني of الحماية. So they lose it, you know, when they also participate in the war. I go and take my gun in my house, I also involve myself in the war. Khalas, you're not going to be protected. You are no longer a civilian because you are participating. So that is called direct participation in hostilities, which refers to acts intended to cause actual harm to enemy military forces or operation, such as taking up arms, gathering intelligence. So if you're not taking up the arm, maybe you are doing some jasus, you're doing some intelligence, or assisting in combat operation, you are assisting the army. So once the civilian ceases such participation, full civilian protection is immediately restored. So once you participate, no protection. But if you leave it, then you're going to be provided with.
Ustad, I have a question.
Yes, please.
What about the people who morally support their army or the operation? Just they only support morally, but they're not participating actively in the war.
Wow.
How about those people?
That's a very good question. That is a very good question. So here, what you're basically saying is that when you are supporting them militarily, that is you are using a gun, or for example, you are doing intelligence, you are participating directly in the act of war. But what you're basically saying morally, that one is not war. For example, you are giving them water, you are providing them with food, you are providing them with shelter. So that is not an act of war. And you're just doing your moral obligation. So nothing, you are still considered a civilian in that case, and you should be protected. So you only lose the right if you support them militarily. Is it clear? Okay. So that was the first part of our lesson. So if you go to YouTube, all these videos, they are explaining the protection of civilians during armed conflicts. You have around 3 videos. Now let us go to the next part quickly. Protection of the wounded, the sick, and the shipwrecked person. So the sick, the wounded, the shipwrecked person. For example, these are people who are fighting in the ship and something happens to their ship. They need some protection also. That is what is meant by shipwrecked. So what is the legal basis of protecting the wounded, the sick, and the shipwrecked? It is still, the legal basis is in the first Geneva Convention. That is the armed forces on land. So the first Geneva Convention provides legal protection for wounded and sick members of armed forces on land. So it defines the obligation of parties to an armed conflict to respect, protect, and care for wounded and sick people, regardless of their nationality or the side to which they belong. So long as you are just wounded in the war, you are sick, we should not be asking you about your jinsia, we should not be asking you about your nationality. So it is our moral obligation to really help you in that case. So it is clearly stated in the first Geneva, even in the second. So this is the armed forces on the land. The same thing applies to the what? When they're on the sea, armed forces at sea. So the second Geneva Convention extends. So the first did not extend, but the second one, it extended the protection. Extends similar protection to wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea. You are fighting on the sea and you get wounded, even if you're the army. So it's not only about the civilians. So it governs naval warfare, the war in seas, oceans, and requires parties to rescue and care for persons in distress at sea following naval engagement, following a fighting in the sea. So they have the right to be protected under the international humanitarian law. Now, the persons protected, what are the definition of those people who are protected? Number one, wounded and sick combatants. So wounded and sick combatants are members of armed forces who, due to injury, disease, or other physical or mental condition, are incapable of taking part in hostilities. So, yes, they are military, but now they've been injured. They are maybe sick mentally, or they have physical issues. So they cannot participate directly in the act of war or hostilities. So such persons must be respected and protected and may not be attacked. You cannot go and attack a wounded person. But unfortunately, this is what is happening in the wars. They don't follow these rules. So these rules are just good as they are written. But if you go to the Ardul Waqia, it does not happen really. Shipwrecked members of armed forces. Shipwrecked persons are members of armed forces or other protected persons who are in peril at sea. Peril means that they need help. They are in a crisis. They're in a disaster. That's the meaning of peril at sea or in other waters, not only sea, but maybe lake, ocean, due to the destruction or loss of their vessel. Maybe their vessel, their ship has been attacked, bombed, or maybe aircraft. So they remain protected as long as they refrain from hostile acts. So long as they don't retaliate, so long as they don't fight, they should be protected. Then Thalithan, civilians who are wounded or sick. So wounded or sick civilians are combatants who suffer injury, illness, or physical or mental impairment during armed conflicts. So they are entitled, it is their right, they are entitled to the same care and protection as wounded combatants without discrimination. Now, the core obligation is also defined. Exactly the nature of protection, what should be done. So the respect and protection. To respect and protect means that parties to a conflict must not attack, harm, or mistreat wounded, sick, or shipwrecked person, and must actively ensure their safety against violence, reprisal, or ill treatment. So what they are basically telling us is that they have the right to be respected, they have a right to be protected, but on a condition. They need to be harmless, they need to be wounded, they need maybe to be mentally incapable. Collection and care without adverse distinction. So the collection and care requires party to search for, collect, and provide medical assistance to the wounded and sick as soon as circumstances permit. We should not delay. Immediately. Care must be given without adverse distinction, meaning without discrimination based on nationality, religion, political opinion, or affiliation. So we are in a war. There are very many people who have been affected by the war. So you cannot start discriminating. Okay, this one is from the Ethiopian. No, we are going to start with the Somalis first. No. The religion, you cannot say, oh, we are Muslim, we are starting with the Muslim first, then later we'll come to the Kuffars, then we'll come to the Munafiqeen, then we'll come to the Mulhideen. No. Political opinion, it does not matter if you are in the government or no. It does not matter your affiliation to party A or party no. Then also, prohibition of murder, torture, or abandonment. So the international humanitarian law strictly prohibits murder, meaning the intentional killing of protected person. You cannot kill people who are protected. You cannot kill civilians. You cannot kill the sick, the wounded. You cannot. Torture, meaning the infliction of severe physical or mental pain. It's not allowed. Abandonment, meaning the deliberate failure to provide necessary care. For example, you have your car. You come across people who need help. They are sick, they are wounded, but you abandon them with your car. Oh, masalam, I'm in a hurry. You leave them behind. That is called to abandon them, to leave people who need help. So all these acts constitute serious violation and war crimes. Now, the emblem protection. So what is the meaning of emblem? Look at these signs. These are people who provide what? They provide medical services. If you see anybody with this sign, any car with this sign, they need to be protected. Why? Because they're giving humanitarian protection. So what is the meaning of this? The Red Cross, the Red Crescent, and the Red Crystal emblems are internationally recognized protective symbols used to identify medical personnel, medical units, transport, that is their ambulances, their cars, and facilities during armed conflict. So emblem protection means that This symbol must be respected at all times. If you just see this symbol, stop shooting. Attacks against persons or objects displaying these emblems are prohibited. So anything that any person who is having this emblem, any house, any vehicle that is having this sign, if you attack it, then it is against the international law. Misuse of the emblems, sometimes they call it perfidy, is forbidden under international humanitarian law. Some people, they put the sign, but inside you find the police or the military. So they are using the ambulance as their vehicle to attack people. It's not allowed in the international humanitarian law. And it happens a lot during the time of war. So you think that these people, they are medical personnel, but inside there are guns, there are military equipments, it's not allowed to misuse those symbols. So the emblems serve as a visible guarantee of neutrality and humanitarian function. So this emblem, the moment you see it, you should be neutral. The moment you see it, stop attacking each other, So it is a symbol of neutrality and human function. Now, so that the third part of our lesson is the treatment of prisoners of war. Who are they? So we are finished with the treatment, protection of the civilians. We are finished with the treatment of the wounded and the sick and the shipwrecked. So we also have the prisoners of war. So these are the people who sometimes they are arrested. And they are, for example, put in a custody, they are put in a place. So what is the legal basis? So again, if you go to the Third Geneva Convention, it is clearly mentioned. What? The Third Geneva Convention of 1949 is the primary legal instrument governing the status, rights, and treatment of the prisoners of war. So it sets out detailed rules to ensure the prisoners of war are treated humanely from the moment of capture until their release and repatriation. From the moment they are released and repatriated means that they're taken to their countries, to their families. So what is the definition of prisoner of war? Who is a prisoner of war? So this is a person who belongs to the armed forces of a party to the conflict and has fallen into the hands of the enemy. So for example, we have, for example, let us say you have Congo and maybe Rwanda. The two armies are fighting. So the prisoners of war, as per this definition, if, for example, the army of Congo, they arrest some members of the forces in what? So the Congo army, they arrest some members of the army in Rwanda's army. They come under their custody. So they are prisoners of war. The same thing in Russia and Ukraine. So you find that they are prisoners of war in Russia. They are originally from Ukraine, but they're now in Russia. They were arrested. The same thing, you find that they are prisoners of war from Russia. They are in Ukraine. So that is the first definition. Also, members of regular armed forces captured by the army, members of regular armed forces. Then thirdly, members of militias or volunteer corps, provided they are under responsible command, wear a distinctive sign, carry arms openly, and conduct operation in accordance with IHL. So members of militias like Shabab, maybe you have the Boko Harams, you have some militias, a lot of militias in Africa, So once captured, such person must be presumed to be prisoners of war until their status is determined. So once they are captured, we assume that the prisoners of war until their status is determined. Until we'll come to interrogate, to know if they are civilians, they are military, they are medical workers. So before that comes. Now, What are the fundamental rights of the prisoners of war? Number one, humane treatment. So this means that the prisoners of war must be treated with respect for their physical and mental well-being at all times, and must not be subjected to cruelty, or they should not be abused. Number two, protection from violence and public curiosity. So the prisoners of war must be protected from violence, intimidation, like telling them, if you don't give us names, we are going to kill you. Insult, they should not be insulted. And exposure to public curiosity, they should not be exposed to the media. Like people are seeing them, pictures being taken of the prisoners of war, of them sitting down, like the pictures I just shown you, including media exploitation or public humiliation. Mamno. Adequate living condition. The prisoners of war are entitled to adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical care, comparable to those provided to the detaining the detaining powers on armed forces. So what you are giving to your forces, you should also give to the prisoners of war. Then respect for honor and dignity. So the honor, dignity, religious beliefs, and personality identity of prisoners of war must be respected at all times. So these are the fundamental rights of the prisoners of war. Now, what are the prohibited acts? So the international humanitarian law strictly prohibits torture of the prisoners of war, meaning the intentional infliction of severe physical or mental pain. You know, and this is what normally happens in most of the detention camps. Forcing prisoners of war to provide military intelligence. You force them, okay, give us the information. Where are they? You know, so you force them to give you all the intelligence beyond basic personal information. So the prisoners of war, what is expected, they're just supposed to give you their basic information. This is my name, you know, my nationality, my work, full stop. You should not ask them about military intelligence. Then also humiliating or degrading treatment, including insult and coercion, is not allowed. So such acts constitute grave breaches and war crimes under international humanitarian law. Now, what is the end of captivity? End of captivity refers to the termination of the prisoner of war detention. When they are now released, we call it end of captivity. So the prisoners of war must be released and repatriated without delay after the cessation of active hostilities. So when the situation is calm, when the situation is okay now, they need to be released, you know, unless they are lawfully detained for criminal proceedings. The only time that they cannot be released, if they are detained in a lawfully way, they are taken to a court of law, and now there are some criminal proceeding against them. But ma'ada dhalik, when the situation is now okay, the situation of hostilities, it's okay, they need to be released. You know, some of them, they need to be taken back to their countries. And this is what happened with Ukraine and Russia. They were exchanging the captives. So Russia khalas sends the Ukraine captives and vice versa. So this is the same thing we were defining. So the end of captivity refers to the termination of the prisoner of war detention. So the prisoners of war must be released and repatriated without delay after this is just a repetition. Now, the last part, is it the last part? I'm not sure. We only have 3 minutes remaining. Protection of women and children in armed conflict. So what is the legal basis? The Fourth Geneva clearly provides for that act. That is, it provides general protection to civilian women and children during armed conflict, ensuring humane treatment and respect for their dignity. And there are additional articles. So protection of women, what is the definition? Women are entitled to special respect and protection due to their vulnerability. Women are weak, like physically, not, we're talking about the physical structure. They're very weak and they're very vulnerable. They cannot protect themselves like the women, like the men. So this protection includes protection against rape. They should not be raped, sexual violence, and forced prostitution, which are strictly prohibited and constitute war crime. Special care during pregnancy and maternity, so including medical assistance and humane treatment. So the international humanitarian law recognizes sexual violence against women as a serious violation of international law. So all these things, women are protected in the international humanitarian law. Now, protection of the children. What is the definition of a children? A child is defined as any person under the age of 18. So children must be protected from recruitment and participation in hostilities, particularly those under 15. They should not be recruited in the army. But unfortunately, it happens. Provided access to education, care, and family reunification after the war. Because sometimes before the war, you find that the mother is east, the father is west, the children, they are south. When the situation stabilizes, we need to bring them together. They should be treated with special care if detained. If they are detained, they should be treated with care, taking account of their age and psychological needs. Children affected by conflict are considered a particularly vulnerable group. They're just like women. They are vulnerable. They are weak. They cannot protect themselves, you know. Child soldiers. Do we have child soldiers? Child soldiers are children who are recruited or used by armed forces or armed groups in any capacity during armed conflict. So the recruitment or use of children in hostilities is prohibited, mamnu, and constitutes a war crime under international law, particularly under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So children should not be soldiers. But unfortunately, in Congo, recently, there were some children who were involved. They were having guns, you know. And even in Uganda, the rebels, they were having some war with, even in South Sudan, we have many children that have been recruited in the army, which is very unfortunate. So that's the end of our lesson. We only have 1 minute remaining. So you will review this, the protection of humanitarian workers. So this was the part that was remaining. Then we have some YouTube. All these videos are explaining what I have been explaining in the lesson today. So because of time, I could not explain the protection of humanitarian workers, but I believe you can review it. Then next week, if there is any question, if there will be anything that is not clear, we can review it together. So is there any question? So that's the end of our lesson. We have 30 seconds remaining before. So I don't have the Zoom that, because I normally use the free Zoom, and the free Zoom is around 35 to 40 minutes. If I use the Google meeting, I cannot record the lesson if I use the Google meeting. So that is why I prefer to use the Zoom, so that I can record the lesson. Yes, please.
Yeah. I talk about the Google meeting. No. So you tell us the limitations it has. That's okay.
Yeah, that is why the first lesson I did not record, because the first lesson I was using the Google meeting. So that is why I was not able to record it.